Hey there, welcome to another episode of the Horror Chronicles. Before we start, I would like to know where in the world you are watching from and what time it is there. Also, if these stories help you to sleep, I would be grateful if you would subscribe to the channel. Now make yourself comfortable, take a deep breath, and let's get started. Story number 1. I've been awake for 18 days. That's not hyperbole or any form of exaggeration. I've genuinely gone all this time without any sleep or rest, not even a wink. And the craziest part is that I don't feel like I need it. I don't know how I'm still alive. These last few days have been some of the craziest of my life, and I feel like it's about to get much worse. The president fell in beside her, his eyes resting on hers. He had a soft, whispering smile that she reasonably recalled saying a few times while they were. It all began on the eve of one of my exams. The dreaded finals week had come around, and although I had studied for it throughout the month of November and prepared myself to the best of my ability, it was still getting to me. Something about having a considerable portion of grades dependent on one test just never sat right with me. I had been lying in my bed for the past 3 hours, tossing and turning, frustrated, unable to allow myself to slip into that glorious world of slumber. It was 4 a.m., and my next final was. Eventually I'd had enough, so I decided to get out of bed and pull an all-nighter to do some extra studying. After all, staying up through the night had always been better than dozing off for 2 hours and then being rudely awoken, surprisingly enough. So with that, I sighed, got up from my bed, and started putting on my clothes. I headed out the door into the warm, humid Floridian air. The campus library was open, as was to be expected. They were always available 24/7 during this time. The building was entirely still. The information desk was open, and some poor soul who had taken the student job was staffing it overnight. I looked over, and she didn't even move her head to notice me, staring blankly at the screen ahead of her. There were other people in here too, just not a lot. Now and then you'd see the occasional chair filled by a zombified student, a cup of coffee in one hand, their laptop in the other, and a lovely pie of pizza resting on the table in front of them. In the center of the main lobby stood a beautifully crafted table with a white cloth draped over it. On top were 2 big metallic cylinders, coffee dispensers, with a basket containing a bunch of small paper cups to the right. Further to the side, a variety of creams, sugars, and sweeteners. The sight didn't surprise me. This school had a tradition of offering free coffee to all students in the late hours during this time. It was a nice gesture for everyone stressing out about their upcoming exams, I suppose. I'm not a coffee drinker, never was. I despise the taste. Still, it was 4 a.m. and I was about to stay up all night, so, with that in mind, I caved and filled up one of the paper shot cups, making sure to load it with so much cream that, frankly, you probably wouldn't be able to call it coffee anymore. With that, I made my way up the stairway to the right, which took me to the 3rd floor, the computer lab. I approached one of the tens of empty computers, logged into my account, and pulled up my professor's PowerPoint presentation. I practically gulped the coffee down in a minute, and it tasted about how you would expect. The coffee was cloudy, and there were threads of redness emerging over the top, although the persistence of the light filtered from the coffee. But the texture was off. As the hot liquid slid its way down my throat, I felt something like a rough surface pass by my tongue. It was almost as if little tiny balls had been in the fluid, like cottage cheese, but a tad less noticeable. I didn't think much of it then, figuring it was probably something I'd put into the beverage, or something with this particular brand. And a quick look inside the cup revealed nothing unusual, so I quickly forgot about it. I was considering getting another one when, just 10 minutes later, the caffeine took effect. It was insanely powerful. more than I expected. My heart was throbbing in my chest as I was jolted into awakeness, and I felt like I had just slept 10 hours. There was an ongoing gag going around the school that they injected the coffee with jet fuel. Well, I guess now I know where that came from. Suffice it to say, I'm glad I didn't follow through on what I was considering. I think I would have succumbed to cardiac arrest almost immediately. I continued studying until about 7 a.m., when the sun began to peek over the horizon. As I exited the building, stepping into the crisp morning air, I still felt perfect. The heart pounding in my chest was the only thing telling me that this period of energy was artificial. I finally understood why people were such avid coffee drinkers, and I thought that maybe I should do this more often. It ended up taking until about 2 p.m. that day for the caffeine to wear off. At last, I could feel my body begin to slow down, and the full effect of the stunt I had just pulled came over me like a rock. It was like somebody had snapped their fingers, and I just crashed. I decided to return to my bed and attempt to sleep off last night. Not for too long, though. After all, I had more finals in the morning, and thinking of that got my fear going once again. I said I had prepared the best I could, but the one that was coming up, oh boy. No matter what I tried, I couldn't figure out half of it, and the thing was worth about 40% of my grade. If I didn't do well on this final, it would tank my class average. A slight panic set in at the thought of it. I should mention that I have a mild case of anxiety, not to the extreme where I get regular panic attacks, but just enough to make every testing situation about 10 times worse than it is for anyone else. I tossed and turned for about 30 minutes in this pit of dread I was drowning in, when suddenly something very peculiar happened. Finally, my sleepiness disappeared again. It was just gone. Entirely and utterly vanquished. I didn't know what to make of it at first, but blamed it on the adrenaline currently shooting through my veins. I decided to splash some cold water on my face and take a hot shower to calm down. It didn't help. 2 hours of laying there passed. Nothing. It didn't make sense to me. It was as if the crash had just ended. She shook her head. As I wasn't getting any sleep, I decided to use this time to work some more. Being so worried about what was coming up and all, I did just that until about 11 p.m. that night. And again, I just still didn't feel tired. I spent hours tossing and turning, hoping, begging myself to fall asleep, but no dice. I had enough at this point. I pulled out my phone and did a quick Google search on how long caffeine is supposed to last. Most results pointed me in the direction of 4 to 6 hours, with the more extreme estimates being up to 12. This had already gone far longer than any of the websites suggested. I rationalized it away by saying that perhaps I was just sensitive to caffeine and that, since this was my first real exposure, it would take a while for the effects to subside. I was going to crash eventually. I just needed to wait it out. But that didn't happen. It was now 4 a.m., and I was still lying awake in bed, feeling no different. I decided to spend the night studying again, very decidedly not taking any of the coffee this time, slightly annoyed that I would likely regret it in the middle of the next morning's final. But finally, I didn't. Nothing had changed, and now I was starting to get concerned. Did I have some adverse reaction or something? What was going on? I called my mom to ask what she had to say. She was equally concerned for my well-being and suggested I take a trip to the university's health center. The best they could do for me was to recommend I take some medication and see if that fixed it, and she instructed me to call a doctor if it didn't. I'm sure you can guess the results of that little experiment. Not only did the medication take no effect, but as I lay awake for hours, a chill sweat began to trickle down my skin. It started gradually, but it eventually became intense, such that my sheets quickly became drenched in the stuff. My head as well was throbbing. A piercing, screaming headache shot its way through my brain, only getting worse, as if I had just been shot. Cocktail's headache had apparently been worse, as if I had just been shot. There was a different kind of thumping in my head, though, one much more unexplainable. On top of the raging headache, I felt something else. A tiny, slight, unrhythmic tapping, seeming to occur in different parts of my brain. I paid close attention as it slowly moved from one side of my forehead to the other, then around the back of my skull, before continuing to wrap itself around. I didn't know what to make of it, and that's also where I drew the line. Enough was enough. I was calling a doctor tomorrow. Well, I did so the following morning, and the response I got was something like, "Sorry, the best we can do is give you an appointment in 2 weeks. Great. All praise the healthcare system, I guess. But accepting it was the only thing I could do, I said, "Okay," booked the meeting, and hoped it wouldn't worsen. The following day was when things started to get a little scary. My mother nearly gasped when she saw me on FaceTime, saying I looked paler than snow. I had to agree with her because, in the middle of our conversation, I got a sudden wave of extreme nausea, gagging harder than I ever had before. I hastily hung up the call and sprinted to the bathroom, just in time to empty my stomach contents into the toilet bowl. I sat there, retching for the next hour. All the while, the headache and those odd, irregular feelings circling themselves around my brain continued. And if that wasn't bad enough, as I was donating my insides to the indoor plumbing, I swear I saw something move in the corner of my eye. It was brief, but it looked like an odd, elongated shape slowly moving up the bathroom wall. I didn't get a good look at it, as it appeared to hurry out of view entirely before I turned around. I searched the entire place, top to bottom, but there was no sign of the damn thing. It was like it had just vanished. That was the final straw. I assumed the sleep deprivation was getting to me, and I was beginning to hallucinate, even though I still felt as awake as ever. But I didn't care anymore. Enough was enough. I could not, in any way, wait 2 weeks for an appointment. And so, without any options left, I picked up the phone and dialed 911. The paramedics arrived within minutes, and I quickly explained the situation to them, and after seeing how terrible I looked, they immediately put me on a stretcher and whisked me away to the local hospital. The 2-hour wait in the emergency room was what I could best describe as miserable. I was stuck sitting on a cheap plastic chair in a sanitary, lit, open room, surrounded by patients suffering from God knows what illnesses. The icing on the cake was that my symptoms continued to worsen throughout my entire stay. My vision was beginning to go hazy, and I swear I kept seeing something move in my peripheral vision, like what I found back in my apartment. Finally, after hours of torture, the doctor finally called me and escorted me to my new room. He introduced himself as Dr. Jones and ran me through some basic questions. You know, the typical stuff. I was examined for depression and fatigue, both of which I did not display. "How are you feeling, Kevin?" "Deromo. Have you taken any drugs recently?" "Other than NyQuil, no." "Do you drink any alcohol?" "Very rarely." It was just your standard, run-of-the-mill doctor's questioning, but soon one toward the end caught my attention. "Did you drink any caffeinated beverages recently?" the doctor asked. I stopped for a moment. The doctor made a rumble of acknowledgement, his expression considerate before shaking it off. "Okay, well that shouldn't be causing this then. I'm going to be honest with you, Kevin. I'm not sure what's happening. So what we're going to do now is run you through a few tests to hopefully determine an answer. And if we can't find anything, then we might have to keep you here overnight to perform a sleep test." I snorted. Sleep test, right. The preliminary tests went exactly as expected. They took some fluids, checked my blood pressure, and looked at my heart rate. All the standard stuff. Everything turned out negative for any sort of issue. My vitals were perfect, frustratingly so. And so I was then quickly informed that they would be proceeding with the sleep examination that night. They escorted me to a place that looked more like a hotel room than a hospital. A big window at the far end would let in plenty of natural light during the day. There was another blurred-out window on the right side, and a neat little old-fashioned lamp stood on a nightstand. The bed itself looked rather cozy and had a lovely wooden finish as a headboard. Passing along the way, I noticed walls pointing to a separate bedroom. If I weren't so ill, I would have admired it. After hooking me up to various pieces of equipment that I couldn't even explain the purpose of, Dr. Jones spoke again. "All right, you're all set up, Kevin. Now don't worry. We're going to be watching from the adjacent room the entire night, okay? So if you need anything, just ask." I nodded my head, the only response I could make in my current state, and watched as he handed me a couple of pills. "Oh, and one more thing, here is some Silener for the night. It's an insomnia medication. It should be more powerful than the stuff you had before. Hopefully, it might have an effect." After I swallowed what he had given me, the doctor made his way out of the room and turned off the lights before closing the door. And just like that, I was left with nothing but complete, overbearing silence, broken only by the gentle hum of machinery. As my eyes hadn't adjusted yet, darkness swallowed everything. I gently eased my head back into the pillow and shut my eyelids, hoping to finally catch some Z's. The bed was really comfortable. In any other situation, I would have fallen asleep within minutes. But now, 1 hour passed. 2 hours passed. I was beginning to get frustrated. It seemed that the tablet the doctor had given me wasn't helping, so I just lay there, staring at the ceiling for some time and holding my eyes shut. Nothing happened until about midnight, and quite frankly, I wish it had stayed that way. I immediately felt the throbbing in my head return, and the gentle taps that seemed to be circulating around my entire head went into overdrive. It was more evenly spread now, too. Rather than being in specific locations, it was across what seemed to be the entire circumference of my brain, all at once. I could almost peer it inside me, all the little contacts like crinkling paper. I sprung up to a sitting position, clutching my face in pain. My eyes had adjusted to the darkness now. What was once pure nothingness had brightened into a shadowy cacophony that ate the corners and walls of the room. The nausea returned, and stars pulsated through my vision. And just then, something caught my eye. It sounded in my ears, too, coming from the dark, shadowy corner that lay just to the left of me, running smoothly and slowly up the wall. Along the wall, I looked over to the source of the noise, which was partially illuminated by the glow of the machinery, and what I saw made my heart drop. Tucked away where the left and back wall met each other was what appeared to be a black, slim, elongated tube of some sort. But no, it wasn't that. I peered closer at it, and I realized it had legs. Hundreds and hundreds of little tiny legs, squirming and latching onto the surface in unison with the noise. The animal slowly crawled its way upward, paying me no attention. Its long body wriggled in perfect harmony as it made its way towards the ceiling. I stayed frozen in fear for a few seconds, before I immediately launched up from my bed and screamed, practically ripping the equipment down from where it was standing, unleashing a loud crash. William hesitated over the wreckage, dropped his single mug and raised it above his head. The doctors stormed into the room and immediately turned on the lights, demanding to know what had happened. I was hysterical. My head was still pounding. It felt like my brain was constrained. There is something in the corner of the... But as I looked to point it out, what I had seen was gone. "Evan, how long did you say you were awake for?" Dr. Jones asked with concern. "It's common with severe sleep deprivation that you may experience hallucinations. It made sense, but what I had seen felt so life-like. Unsurprisingly, the doctors informed me that they would have to cancel the sleep test because my raucous of throwing everything to the floor managed to break the equipment I was strapped to. So, yay me. However, they said that they could retrieve all the data up until now, and that they would be able to review it as soon as possible, and decided it would be best to move me to a standard hospital room while they awaited my results. They could barely move me 5 feet before I started gagging, and soon the floor was greeted with a pristine covering formed from my stomach contents, delivered by yours truly. Jokes aside, I finally got a good look at what was coming out of me. It was filled with what looked like tiny black spheres. I didn't know what to make of it. Quite frankly, I was worrying about other things, but it seemed to stun the doctors for a moment too. However, they quickly got back to the task and escorted me out into the hallway. I didn't see what became of my mess afterward. After getting into an admittedly less comfortable hospital bed, I finally had the opportunity to scroll through my phone. It was completely blown up with panicked messages from my mother, asking me what was happening and demanding to know why I wasn't answering. I called her back, and the second she saw the medical bed behind me, she nearly exploded into tears. Her lips parted in panic when I told her about my medication. Her body hunched up to meet me. "What happened?" she cried out. I explained everything that had been going on since I last called her, the sudden wave of nausea I experienced, calling 911, and the sleep test. We, or rather she, came to the conclusion that she would fly down and visit me as soon as possible to hopefully get this whole situation sorted. It was nice, a silver lining in all this awfulness. At the very least, I was going to be able to see my mother again. Dr. Jones interrupted our conversation, and after I said one last goodbye to my mother, he simply sat down and sighed. He was holding what looked to be a couple of sheets of paper in his hand. "Hey, Kevin," he started. "So, we've been reviewing your sleep test data as promised and, well," he showed me what looked to be a graph with a long, squiggly line complete with small valleys and ever-towering hills. "Your brain waves, they're highly irregular. Look." He began tracing his finger along the jagged line, and they nearly go off the graph here when you had your episode. It's highly alarming. I stared at him in silence, not knowing exactly what to say. "One thing's for sure, we're going to have to get a head CT done as soon as possible. I'll see how soon I can get you in for an appointment." I could barely utter an okay before he left the room, and finally, I completely broke down. This whole thing, it was a massive nightmare. I had no idea why this was happening, and it seemed like even the doctors, the world-class professionals, did not have any semblance of a clue either. I just wanted this all to end. I just wanted to get some sleep finally. I wanted to stop seeing that creature in the corner of my eye. Experts say things like this can happen, but alas, I should have known my prayers would all fall on deaf ears. A few hours later, Dr. Jones returned and escorted me to the head examination room. It was small and white, with what looked to be some sort of control desk behind a wall in the front, and a large machine resembling an MRI taking up most of the space, making a lot of noise. Far more than I had expected. I lay down on the little bed, feet facing the device, and put my arms over my head as the assistant wheeled me into the machine. I can't lie, I had a certain amount of dread come over me. I knew this was all normal procedure and that it was going to be painless, but something about this was daunting. Dr. Jones and the others returned to the control area near the entrance and advised me the scan was about to begin. However, I didn't even make it for what seemed like 5 seconds when there appeared to be distress from the control center, and one of the assistants practically ran out of the room. My heart began to pound in my chest. Dr. Jones approached me immediately, a grim expression on his face. "Listen, Kevin," he sighed. Normally, CT scan results take weeks to get back to you, but we've seen some things here that I believe might have to be taken care of now. He ushered me back to the area he had been in during the process and pointed at the computer screen, and I nearly gasped when I saw the image being projected. There was a picture of my head, which was to be expected, but there was something else. Wrapped around my brain was a long bug-like creature with two big antennas at the front and an uncountable amount of legs. The whole thing bore resemblance to a giant millipede, yet it was slightly fatter and was long enough to cover the entire circumference of my brain twice. There was something else, though. That creature looked precisely like the one I had been seeing in my hallucinations, albeit a bit smaller. "My grandfather was a priest," Hall said. My heart lurched in my chest as I stared at the unnerving image. I was feeling sick to my stomach, but not due to the illness this time. "What the hell?" I exclaimed. "Yeah," Dr. Jones commented. "I have no idea where this came from. I've never seen anything like it before. But we're going to have to get it out of you pretty fast." I could only bob my head in agreement, still lost in my thoughts. This passenger had been sitting inside me for God knows how long. Was that what I felt when I experienced that tapping inside my head? Was it that Tunsa crawling around up there? As if on cue, it started again. I paid closer attention this time, and I could really feel it. All those little legs skittering along my brain. I immediately dissolved into a blind panic, but that only seemed to make it pick up the pace. It almost seemed excited or stimulated in some way. My headache returned, and I collapsed to the ground. My fear briefly forgotten, Dr. Jones stood up to help me back to my feet and looked at me with a concerned expression. "Look, Kevin. I'll try to schedule surgery to get it removed as soon as possible. Until then, just try not to think about it too hard, okay? Don't think about it too hard." That was easier said than done. How was I supposed to go back to my room and pretend something like this hadn't just made itself a home up there? My terror got worse as I was ushered back to my room. I still felt it the whole time. It had gotten active recently, and my symptoms were starting to flare up again. I was overwhelmed with illness the second I got back and immediately sprinted toward the bathroom. The substance I excreted looked the same as before, filled with those weird black spheres. I didn't pay attention to it, though. I was still thinking about that thing. It had been real. Maybe my visions hadn't been, but whatever that was had been living inside me this whole time. I tried desperately to calm myself down and tell myself it would be out in a day. That didn't make it any better. After finishing my rounds, I got up weakly to wash my hands, and that's when I saw it. Slightly above my eyebrows, in the middle of my forehead, was what appeared to be a massive bulge. It sat there, completely still. As I looked at it further, I realized it wasn't just that. It was a long, winding, bug-like cylinder that circled itself around my entire head. I could even see the pieces of my hair slightly displaced by the shape as it sheathed beneath them. Sheathed. Slowly above my eyebrows, it sat and rested upon one point of my skull, as if to signify. I don't know what came over me, but somehow, all worry and tension immediately disappeared. I found my right hand slowly drifting up towards my scalp, as if it had a mind of its own. I'd say I tried to stop it, but that would be a lie. It was almost like I was in some sort of trance. My mind had gone completely blank as my arms slowly hovered up further toward the anomaly. I'd never had that then. I touched it and squeezed it gently. It was soft, almost like some sort of sponge, but I didn't have much time to register it as it immediately squirmed away, darting out of view and behind my head at a speed that looked similar to a bullet fired from a gun. This is what finally ripped me from my state. I screamed and leaped backward, almost splitting my head on the bathroom tiles. I sat there breathing heavily for a moment, hyperventilating, nearly crying, before I worked up the courage to look back into the mirror. It was gone. I did a complete 360 to make sure, but no matter what angle I checked, it wasn't there anymore. My headache intensified once again, and I ran to my bed, curling up in the fetal position, tears streaming from my eyes. I remained like that for hours. The doctors had come in to check on me and see what was wrong, but after I explained what I had seen, they found nothing. Still, their presence helped calm me down a tiny bit. That night, I simply lay staring at the ceiling. I don't think I would have been able to sleep, even if I didn't have this odd condition. Nothing else happened, but still, it was bad enough. The image of what I saw on the CT scan and what happened to me later in that bathroom was haunting, and no matter how hard I tried, I simply could not get it out of my head. The echoes of my thoughts muted in the walls as I tried to remember. My mom arrived the following morning, and I explained everything to her. She was understandably just about as freaked out as I was, but she relaxed a tad bit when I told her about the doctor's plans to remove what was now being dubbed a parasite. My mom sat silently for a few moments, shaking her head. My neurosurgeon, with a team of doctors, an assistant, and my anesthesiologist, came in a few minutes later, announcing that it was time to perform the surgery, and told my mom to remain in the waiting room. With one last hug, we said goodbye and split up to hopefully see each other again once this was over. "Don't worry, I'm gonna take good care of you," my anesthesiologist reassured me as she prepared the machine. Bright, blinding lights sprang to life as the doctors prepared their tools and laid them out on the table next to me. I knew I wouldn't be feeling any of this, but still, I have to admit, it did give me a small pit in my stomach to see all of the sharp objects that were about to be used on me. They stuck an IV into my arm and hooked me up to all kinds of equipment, including heart rate and blood pressure monitors. I listened as the rhythmic beeping sprang to life and tried to ease myself, staring into the piercing lights above. Resting my head on Matthew's chest, I tried to stay. "Okay, Kevin," my anesthesiologist smiled. "Once I set this mask on your face, I want you to count down from 10 in your head. I promise you will be asleep before you reach 0. With that, she gently placed it over my nose and, slowly breathing in the chemicals streaming through the tube, I did as she'd requested. 9, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. I reached the end of my 10-second countdown. I was still awake. I began to worry. Nothing around me had changed. I tried to say something, to get up and tell the doctors that I was still there, but the second I tried to move, I realized I couldn't. I was locked in place, bound to the table, completely paralyzed. I couldn't even do so much as wiggle my fingers. My heart beat faster in my chest as I looked over at the anesthesiologist, who was viewing my heart rate and other vitals, and thankfully, she seemed to realize something was wrong, too. "He's awake," she said bluntly, slightly confused as she stared at the screens in front of her. "Don't start yet. I'm going to increase the dosage." She turned some knob on the machine connected to my mask, and all of a sudden, I felt an intense surge of the stuff getting pushed through the tube, far more potent than it had been before, forcing itself into my nose. My paralysis was getting stronger, but I was still not falling asleep. I began to panic, as evidenced by the ever-increasing beeping on the monitor beside me. The anesthesiologist started to swear under her breath as she turned the dial up even more, almost bringing it to its max. But nothing was working. I lay there, awake on the table, unable to do or say anything while the doctors all crowded around me, trying to get me to go under. Suddenly, the lights above me went out and the room went completely dark. All the medical staff blurred into the sides of my vision, still and unmoving. What was once a soundscape filled with the frantic movement of personnel and nurses and the rapid beeping of machinery was replaced with complete and utter silence. I sat there, breathing heavily, and that thing began to scurry again, rushing as I felt it crawl all around my head. I wanted to throw up. It was incredibly disgusting, and it just wouldn't stop. There was something else, though. A couple of minutes passed, and something crept through the silence. A soft but noticeable crackling noise came from the far end of the room. Something I couldn't see from here, slowly making its way ever closer. I stared into the distance in terror as the sound unmistakably began wiggling its way up the foot of my bed before changing slightly, now sounding like small, tiny micro-taps on plastic. It wasn't long before two creepy small antennas became barely visible, peering through the darkness just into view. A couple of seconds later, the head arrived. It was here, the same creature I had seen on the CT scan, although it looked much larger. It continued to work its way up the end of my bed and slithered down the other side. I tried to get up, to run, but the paralysis drug that the anesthesiologist had given me was doing its job. I was still stuck. I was left helpless, only able to watch in horror as it slowly squirmed its way over onto the bed and up onto my foot, giving me the sensation of hundreds of tiny little appendages pushing their way up my body. It was relaxed, seemingly unfazed by all my struggles as it got closer and closer, gently wrapping its way around my limbs. I could look at it now. It definitely resembled a massive millipede, but no exoskeleton existed. Instead, what made up the body seemed to be a pale, fleshy mass, laced with a pattern of black marks strewn across the entire specimen. In my mind, the image of this monster pervaded my mind and fed into my feelings of guilt and fear. It reached my stomach and made a straight beeline for my face. I tried as hard as I could to hold my head back and keep it as far away as possible, but it was futile. All the while, the back half of it had just crossed over the far bed frame. My eyes watered as it slowly crawled over my neck and made contact with my chin, its long antennas now taking up a good chunk of my vision. I didn't seem to be wearing my mask anymore. I don't know when it disappeared, but it was missing, which gave that thing the opportunity to reach between my lips with its little front legs and slowly pry open my mouth with a strength I wouldn't believe it had. There's gotta be one of the first opportunity to reach between my mouth and stab some glistening bacon, eh? More powerful than I tried again in vain to turn my head to do something to counteract it, but nothing worked. The only movements I made were the spastic twitches of my muscles as I shook like a leaf. Once the creature had opened my mouth just enough, I gagged as it slowly began to crawl its way inside. I felt every movement of the tiny bug limbs creeping on my tongue, the fleshy mass slowly rubbing against the top of my mouth. I wanted to throw up so badly, to cough, but for some reason, those reflexes weren't working. All I could do was gag over and over again as its long, segmented body maneuvered its way in like a snake setting its skin. The head reached the back of my throat and began to work its way up towards the top of my skull. As I watched more and more of its body disappear behind my lips, I heard the sound and then saw more and more of these creatures. Smaller ones began to appear at the sides of the bed and weaved their way towards me. Some crawled toward my face, others maneuvered themselves across every square inch of my body. I tried to scream, but nothing came out. I began hyperventilating, looking at the scene in front of me with terror. Each time I looked, there were more and more, appearing out of thin air, exploring every little nook and cranny of me. A pounding, throbbing headache ensued, and above all that, I felt the original parasite continue to crawl its way around in my brain, faster than it ever had before. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying for the nightmare to end. After what felt like forever, the lights above me blared to life, and I launched out of the bed and let out a shriek as I flailed my arms around. I nearly smacked the hand of the anesthesiologist dead on as she immediately grabbed hold of my shoulders, trying to ease me back into the bed. "Easy, easy," she said. I wanted to yell at her, but then I realized everything I had just seen, all those bugs, those creatures, they were gone. It was just me and the doctors in an operating room with a highly rapid heartbeat monitor. I took a second to collect my bearings and looked at the mask sitting on the bedside table. They had taken me off the medication. When I asked about it, I instantly collapsed into tears and begged for my mother. Her tiny frame crumpled protectively around me. "We're going to have to try something else," one doctor said. "Removing it isn't going to work if we can't get him under." I sighed and let out a sigh that was probably more cadence than one. I nearly tackled my mom when I saw her again and explained everything about my horrible experience in that operating room. I told her about waking up and seeing faces on my pillow staring back at me from the wall. Dr. Jones came in a couple of minutes later with a grim expression. "Okay, Kevin, I'm sorry about what you just went through. For now, we've decided that we're going to try and give you some antiparasitic medication and see if that will help your condition. I hate to tell you this, but the medical staff is a little lost right now because you've been infected with a species we've never seen before, so we'll call in some researchers to better understand your condition." "Robert!" My mother immediately stood up in protest. "You are not going to run experiments on my son." Dr. Jones simply looked at her with professionalism. "They aren't experiments, ma'am. We're just going to study the best course of action to hopefully kill or get this parasite out of him. And, besides, it's Kevin's choice." So, they both looked at me, and I sighed. I desperately wanted this as far away from me as humanly possible, and so, with nothing left to lose, I accepted. The next 7 days, my condition didn't get much better. I had been awake for 13 days at this point. But it was weird, because despite how horrible I felt, I still didn't feel the need to sleep. I still felt just as awake as when this whole thing had begun, and at this point I had resigned myself to not feeling sleepy ever again. Until this was over. I requested to spend my nights with my mother because, after my surgery encounter, I didn't want to be lying in my room alone at night, and the presence of my mother helped put me at ease. She even taught me to laugh about it all a little, and as time went on, mysteriously, the hallucinations became slightly more diluted, something which the researchers quickly picked up on. Oh yeah, at this point I was also being watched by a team of them, 24/7. I was doing constant tests, scans, the whole deal. The anti-parasitics they were trying seemed to have no effect. I guess that was to be expected. The next day, one of the researchers came in and told me he had an idea. My symptoms seemed to calm down when I was at a state of ease and flare up when I was stressed or scared. So he proposed giving me a high dose of a medication that's supposed to regulate my stress hormones. I tried it for 2 days, and the scientists' theories were all but confirmed because my hallucinations and all my other symptoms weakened significantly. A subsequent CT scan revealed the thing had grown much smaller than it had been before. It was starving. This is what led to the current theory that the parasite likely feeds off of stress hormones or other things your body produces during these periods. They continued this pattern for the next 2 days, until my symptoms became so mild they almost didn't exist anymore. I was still stuck awake, but everything else had been diluted to an absolute minimum. The parasite on the CT scan looked like a shriveled husk of what it used to be. Dr. Jones came into the room that day and delivered a message that almost made my stomach drop. He said that, if possible, he would like to try the surgery again, given the thing had gotten so weak that the researchers didn't think it could overpower the anesthesia as it had before. I halted for a moment. On the one hand, I was eager to be done with this, but on the other, I didn't want to relive what I had. Dr. Jones assured me that they would be starting with a very low dose, and if they didn't notice an effect, they would immediately call off the operation. After a long debate between my mom and the doctors, we decided to proceed. Thankfully, the surgery went off without a hitch. When I came to, I finally saw the thing that had caused me all this trouble with my own eyes. It was dead, lying on the bedside table, fully stretched out. It looked the same as what I'd seen in my hallucinations, albeit a lot smaller. I even got to name the damn thing. Neural sleep parasite had an excellent ring to it. Before long, they hauled off that monster for further study, and I never saw it again. They explained to me that I had most likely ingested its eggs when drinking that coffee back in the library, and that, combined with the high-stress response, allowed it to sort of take over my brain for a while. But I cut them off. I didn't want to hear more about this. I was done. I was released from the hospital a few hours later, got into my car, and drove back to my apartment with my mom. I know you will say I probably should have let her drive, but after all this, I was so eager to get back to a normal life. Once we reached my apartment, the phone rang, and I picked it up. However, I regretted it very soon because the past 18 days of no sleep hit like a truck in the middle of the journey. Without the parasite continuously stimulating my body, I needed to sleep again, and now my brain was about to demand I pay up the tab. Without realizing it, I began to doze off at the wheel in seconds and drifted into an oncoming lane. A shrill scream from my mom sitting next to me was the only thing that stopped us from slamming into a massive 18-wheeler with a combined speed of 140. I ripped the car back to the proper lane, adrenaline surging through my body. I immediately pulled over and let my mom take the wheel, realizing my stupid mistake. It goes without saying she drove me home the rest of the way. She stopped and looked at me with a confused expression on her ponderous face. I saw her eyes were bright with tears at the moment. On arriving at my apartment, I immediately made plans to dive into bed. It was time to catch up on those 18 days of lost sleep. Or so I thought, because immediately after I jumped under the covers, my tiredness vanished. I began to panic, but forced myself to think clearly. They said I ingested its eggs with that coffee. What if there was more than one? Or what if it had laid more while it was inside me? Come to think of it, those odd black spheres coming out of me all the time were unsettling. I just never thought to bring it up because there was always something else of critical importance happening. I'm writing this now with a piercing headache as all of my symptoms are beginning to rush back. Hey, I think I just felt something crawl under my skull. Story number 2. It was a cold, rainy day in December. There was less than a week until we got out of school for winter break. Usually my teachers don't give us work before a break, but my bastard of a history teacher decided he'd assign us a 2,000-word report due the day before we got out. I knew I wasn't going to be there then. I was going up to the mountains in North Carolina to spend Christmas and New Year's in Lenoir with some old friends I hadn't seen since I moved. So in other words, I had to turn in the report a few days prior, as in that day. So, deciding I'd get started, I found a book I thought would help me and sat down at a table with my laptop so I could begin my report. After what seemed like forever, I finished my report and printed it out. I went to go get my paper from the printer, and when I got back, I noticed a small, black book sitting on top of my laptop, which was now closed. Now, this was strange. Not so much that someone was messing with my stuff, because that was common at my school. It was just that the printer I used was just across the room, and I didn't see anyone walking anywhere near the table I was at. Another thing I found strange was that nobody else seemed to notice it. Not that I'm ever exactly the center of attention, but if you saw a book appear seemingly out of nowhere onto someone's computer, wouldn't you at least raise an eyebrow? Anyways, I could feel that something was off about the book, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. I decided to take it home with me. It was only until later that I realized what a hell of a mistake that was. I quickly went to my teacher to turn in my assignment, then left the building and began walking towards my apartment. Yeah, I know it might be strange for a junior in high school to live in his own apartment, but my parents divorced when I was 13 because my mother used to abuse me, so living with my father was my only option. My father comes from a rather wealthy family, and living with him was great until he died in a car crash on his way back home from a business trip when I was 15. I was sad, of course, but I didn't have any time for moping. I had to figure out my living situation first. I already decided that it would be a cold day in hell before I moved back in with my mother, so I had nowhere to go. Luckily, my grandmother was kind enough to let me live with her until I was old enough to move out. Because I started school so late, I turned 18 at the start of this school year. So, with the money my father left me, I rented an apartment of my own and have been living there since. Anyways, when I got home, curiosity overcame me, and I grabbed the book from my bag and looked at it. It was dusty and obviously very old. The book was black, and the spine and edges of it were weathered and beaten. Filled with renewed curiosity, I opened the book. The first thing I noticed when I opened the book was that there was an inscription on the back of the front cover, which read, "To the reader, do not read." I thought that was rather strange, as I didn't understand how a person could read something without actually reading it. But, as any careless person my age would, I didn't take heed to the alleged warning and proceeded to turn to the first page. As soon as I saw what was on the first page, or more accurately, what wasn't, I was slightly taken aback, if that's even the right word for it. I turned to the next page, still nothing. Same thing with the next page, and the next. After fruitlessly flipping through the pages and seeing absolutely nothing on all of them, I closed the book and decided I would try to return the book to the library the next day. For now, I needed sleep. So I went to my bedroom and went to sleep. In it, the book was floating in front of my face, and the pages were flipping like crazy, and a strange voice was telling me, "I warned you," over and over. It wasn't a human voice. It sounded as though it had multiple voices, like you would expect a demon to sound in a horror movie, and it had no regular rhythm to it. It didn't sound human. The pages in the book stopped flipping at a page somewhere in the middle of the book. Black ink droplets began to rain down onto the page from a pen, whose holder was invisible to me. The ink droplets began to form letters, which formed two words. When the floating pen finished its statement, I read it. The page bore large, bold letters which spelled out the words, "Now suffer." After that, I woke up. I hadn't had a nightmare since I was 10, so this was odd. The air around me felt tense, like when you think something bad is about to happen. I waited a few minutes before laying back down and attempting to go back to sleep. After a while, my father walked over to my mother and hugged her, then kissed her on her forehead before walking across the room and doing the same to me. He announced that he was off to work, and he grabbed his keys and headed out the door. That's when things got even stranger. My mother turned to look at me with a twisted smile on her face. I was worried about what she might do to me. Would she abuse me again? She moved closer to me, and I flinched. Then she opened her mouth and spoke. She smiled warmly at me and said, "Well, that's good." "Huh? But you won't be for much longer," a deep voice said, shocking me. I was paralyzed with fear as the realization hit me. It was the same voice I had heard in the other dream. My mother didn't react to the sudden stream of words, but she began to speak again. This time, her voice was strange, and she moved closer to me with every word she said. Her smile twisted. "I warned you, human," she said, her voice growing progressively deeper with each word she said. When it reached the same pitch as the voice from before, she began to speak the familiar words I had heard before. "Now suffer." I shot upright, breathing heavily, my shirt sticking to my back. I looked over to my nightstand. On it, next to my alarm clock, rested that damn book. Though I knew it was just a dream, a sudden impulse drove me to grab the book, and I began frantically flipping through the pages. After seeing that all the pages were blank, I flopped back down onto my bed and sighed loudly. "I have to get rid of that book. I have to," I muttered to myself. After deciding I wasn't going back to sleep, I vowed to take the book back to the library the next day. After laying down, staring at the ceiling for several minutes, I reached out and grabbed my phone off of the nightstand. I clicked the power button once to turn the screen on and opened up my phone's web browser. I searched the internet for anyone who might have had the same issue as I am. I doubted I would find anyone, but with all that's been happening since yesterday, I decided it was worth a try. After searching the web for what felt like hours, I came across a website called creepypasta.com. What the hell was a creepypasta? I decided to click the link. I soon discovered that creepypasta.com was a website that contained several horror stories, which, from what I had gathered, were called creepypastas. There were tales of a mysterious tall man called Slender Man and a psychotic murderer called Jeff. There were also many other stories, such as encounters with various other creatures, such as the rake, but none that matched the same symptoms as what I was going through. Flustered, I threw my phone down and put my hands over my face. What the hell was I going to do? I didn't want to face those terrible nightmares again, but I couldn't just not sleep, right? "Damn it," I said. It was then that I got the feeling that someone, or something, was watching me. "Damn what?" a voice said from behind me. I whipped my head around to see who was speaking, but saw nothing. "This wouldn't be happening to you if you had obeyed my warning, boy." "What? Who are you? Where are you?" I stuttered, shaking in my seat. "I can tell you are feeble-minded." "What do you mean?" "From the way you act after only a few nightmares, you'll never make it through what's coming." "How do you know that? Are you the thing that was talking to me in my dreams?" "No, but I am one who can help you." After hearing that, I relaxed a bit, but I was still nervous. "How?" I asked. "By opening the book, you have agreed to the rules of the game," the voice said, dodging my question. "Game? What game? What are you talking about?" I stammered. "You will know in time. Farewell. For now." No, wait. But I could feel that whatever had been talking to me was gone. I didn't feel its presence anymore. That night, I vowed that I wouldn't sleep, but at around 2 a.m., my eyes became heavy, and I found myself drifting off. I slept fitfully, odd dreams plaguing my mind as I rested. At around 3:15 a.m., I woke up to a loud crash that sounded like it was from my kitchen. I froze, fear beginning to eat away at the corner of my mind. After a while, I regained the ability to move. Everything was still and silent, but the air felt tense, like last night after my first nightmare. I rose to my feet and quickly, but silently, crept over to the corner of my closet where I grabbed the wooden baseball bat I kept in the corner of my room. Afterwards, I opened my door as quietly as I could and crept through the hallway of my apartment, baseball bat at the ready. As I approached the kitchen, I began to hear a soft whoosh sound, like the pages of an old book turning. As I reached the kitchen, I saw that nothing had been destroyed, or even touched for that matter. I began to wonder if I had imagined the whole thing. Then, I saw it. It was the book. It sat on the countertop, but I know that I left it on my nightstand. If that wasn't bizarre enough, its pages were flipping as if wind were rustling through it, but none of the windows were open. Even if they were, there was no wind blowing outside. I backed away slowly. Suddenly I began to feel cold, but it wasn't like a winter cold. It was as though I was being chilled to the very core, within my soul itself. I began shivering uncontrollably while I crossed my arms over my chest in a pathetic attempt to warm myself from the sudden, unforgivable cold. And then a voice began to speak. At first it sounded like really loud wind, but after a while I began to hear words from the noise, like a person whispering. I made out the words, "Sacrifice. You must make sacrifice." "Sacrifice," I repeated under my breath. Surprisingly, the voice heard me and gave a chilling response of yes. What I asked the voice. "I am the game master," came the reply. "Game master, game? What game? What the hell's going on?" I said, my voice shaky. "All games have rules, and you agreed to mine. Now you will play my game by those rules. You are my pawn. Now." Pawn? It was like my life had been turned into a board game, but I still had no idea what rules the thing was talking about. How can I obey something I know nothing of? Now, sacrifice must be made. What sacrifice? As a pawn in my game, you are after the prize. In order to obtain such a prize, you must win the game. Win the game, and you will obtain that which you desire most. Well, how exactly do I win the game? "Sacrifice will be made," said the voice. "What if I don't play your game? What if I don't want to obey your rules?" I said. "I wouldn't do that." The voice replied with an edge to its voice that sent chills down my spine. If it was trying to intimidate me, it had definitely done its job. I guess I had no choice but to play the thing's game. But sacrifice? What kind of sacrifice? And what did I desire most? This was all just so confusing. Suddenly, a wave of nausea nearly knocked me down, and I found myself immensely exhausted. I decided I would try to get some sleep and figure out the rest tomorrow. For the rest of the night, I didn't have any nightmares, or at least none that I remember. When I woke up in the morning, I stretched and followed the almost instinctual routine of reaching over to my nightstand to grab my phone. When my hand reached where I had placed the phone the night before, however, my hand made contact with a small, rectangular object. Curious and slightly confused, I looked over and my eyes were met with the sight of the black book I had grown familiar with over the past few days. I jerked my hand away and stared at the book, horrified. Any confusion or fear I had felt before paled in comparison to how I felt now. It wasn't as if strange things hadn't already been happening recently, but I knew for a fact that I left the book on the counter the night before. I decided I was going to try to return the book to the library where I had found it, so I groggily climbed out of bed and put on a pair of jeans, then slipped on some shoes and grabbed my keys off my nightstand. I reached over to grab the book, but when my hand made contact with it, a shock ran through my body, like if you were to put a screwdriver in an electrical outlet. My hand touching the book started to burn, as if my whole hand was completely submerged in a pot of boiling water. Once again, I jerked my hand away from the book and held my scorched hand up to my face. To my surprise, however, my hand was not burned at all. The pain subsided and the voice from last night came to me. There was anger in its voice. "You agreed to the rules of my game, and you will play by them. There is no escaping the fate which you have brought upon yourself, just as a pawn may only move where the holder of the piece moves it." I felt the color drain from my face, and I turned in the direction I thought I heard the voice from, but to no avail. Nothing was there but the closed door of my bedroom. I heard the deep, voiced laughter of the game master, and chills ran down my spine at the sound. "You may only see me if I reveal myself to you, just as mortals will never see their God. And were I to reveal myself to you, you would go insane, and that would kill the fun before it even began." I stood there, speechless. The voice laughed again, but it was less full of malice this time. It sounded like a person does when they are praising their pets for doing something good. "Good, good, my pawn. Now, rest up, for the game will truly begin tomorrow." I was about to protest, as I had just woken up and had things to do. However, as I began to speak, a wave of nausea, then exhaustion came over me. I felt lightheaded and stumbled backwards, my vision blurred. I fell back onto my bed and my eyes closed. I fell asleep instantly. That night, my dream was of the voice. It was, again, telling me the rules, but it sounded less like it was directed at me and more like it was addressing an audience. Also, for the entirety of the dream, I was floating in a completely black area, entirely submerged in shadows. I looked around, and upon closer inspection, I could see shadows of what looked like people. They were gathered in a loose circle, me included. Then, a bright ball of light came from somewhere above. What was strange, though, was that the light wasn't illuminating anything. It was just there. Then, the voice spoke again. "Now, my pawns, awaken, and let the game begin." My eyes opened, still disoriented from sleep and slightly confused. I found myself in my room, laying in my bed. I reached for my phone, and like before, my hand was met with the book. I rolled my eyes and lifted the book up and towards me. I opened the cover, and on the first page, there was today's date, and below it a small line of bold text, which read, "The games begin." I almost dropped the book in my surprise and became dizzy. My vision blacked out for a second, and when it came back, I was surprised and a little scared to find myself in a large room that looked like an old temple. Everything was silent, and I didn't dare make a noise. I know it's stupid, but I had seen too many horror movies, and I was scared of something jumping out at me if I spoke. Deciding there was no point in just standing there, I silently crept forward, further into the temple. As I progressed further in, the room grew brighter, as if the sun were shining in through some window from above me. I looked up and was surprised to find no window there at all, or anywhere for that matter. It was as though the light came from nowhere. I continued walking and eventually reached a large, open area. The floor, from what I could tell, was made of small stone tiles that covered the entire room. As I grew closer to the center of the room, I saw that the tiles changed color at one point, and the different colored tiles formed a large, round space that encircled a smaller black area. What surprised me about this was that the black area at the center seemed unchanged by the light of the room. It was as though the light wasn't reaching it. I grew closer until I was standing on one of the tiles that made up the large circle and stopped. Then, I heard a loud, thunderous roar. I squeezed my eyes shut and covered my ears with my hands in a pathetic attempt to block out the terrible noise. Eventually, the noise quieted, and I was able to make out laughter in the noise. I opened my eyes and looked around, and I saw people standing on the other tiles in the blocky circle. There weren't many, just 3. They were cloaked in shadows, much like the people from my dream the night before. They appeared to be looking upwards, so I did the same. My eyes were met with a small ball of light, similar to the one from my dream the night before, that illuminated the room, took the shape of what looked like a giant man but slightly different. It had horns coming from what looked like a crown resting on top of its head. The figure's arms were massive and hung down past its waist, where its lower body faded into what resembled a torn curtain where its legs should have been. "Are you the Game Master?" I asked, with the icy fingers of fear beginning to grip me. The gargantuan creature glanced down at me and began to laugh. Its laughter resounded throughout the entire temple, sending shock waves of terror down my spine. Player 1, quite an intelligent person you are, very observant. Correct, you are. But how far will that intelligence bring you? I think it's time we found out, the thing said. When it finished its last sentence, the shadowy figures turned to stare at me. Their eyes, or where their eyes should have been, were replaced with glowing, red orbs. The eyes were full of malice and hatred. The other figures continued to stare at me until my vision blacked out again, and I was standing outside of my apartment. I must have been asleep again. It took me a while to regain my composure, as I felt severe nausea when I awoke and almost fell down. Afterwards, I was filled with the urge to go talk with my grandmother about what was happening. Not because I thought she would believe me, but I needed to tell someone. I walked into my apartment and into my room. Surprisingly, my car keys weren't on my nightstand where I had left them. I checked my pockets, wondering if they were there, and when I heard the familiar jingle of the keys, I breathed a sigh of relief. I turned and walked back outside, got into my car, and drove to my grandmother's house. When I reached her house, I felt tenseness in the air. Like before, immediately my mind rang with the feeling that something was wrong. Had something happened to Grandma? I rushed up to the front door, shoved it open, and raced inside the house. The ringing sensation that something had happened grew to a deafening roar, but the house was still and silent. After a while, I began to hear a soft dripping sound. I began to move towards the sound, and as I grew closer, the steady dripping sound grew clearer and more pronounced. Worried about the possibilities of what could have happened to my grandmother, I moved more quickly towards the sound and eventually reached her bathroom. What I saw sent chills down my spine. My grandmother was on her knees, face down in a pool of water, which I guessed was formed from the dripping of the shower head. I was about to rush over to her, but I noticed a hand on top of her head. I traced it back up to a figure, dressed completely in black, who held my grandmother's head in the water. Why? I asked the mysterious figure. Aha, player 1. Pleased to make your acquaintance, the figure said, its voice low and masculine. It must have been a man, but his face was covered in shadows, so I couldn't see what he looked like. But our meeting will be short-lived. The man turned and charged at me, grabbing my neck and slamming me against the wall across the hall from the bathroom. I winced in pain and tried to escape from my attacker, but his grip was firm. I began to find it progressively harder and harder to breathe, and eventually my vision dimmed, and I saw a flashback to when I was speaking with the voice in my kitchen. Win the game and you will obtain that which you desire most. What I desired most? I desired my grandmother's life back. I felt anger begin to grip my oxygen-deprived body, and my strength returned. I lashed out at the man's stomach with my knee as hard as I could, and he grunted and moved backwards slightly. His grip on my neck loosened, and I was able to breathe again. I repeated my action, but he grabbed my leg and throat again and slammed me on the ground. At this point, rage had taken over, and I didn't feel the impact of the blow. I glanced around me, looking for something I could use as a weapon, and I saw my grandmother's broomstick laying a few feet away from me. I kicked out my leg at the man, but he caught it, and I pulled down with my leg as hard as I could. He stumbled, and that gave me enough of a time gap to grab the broomstick and swing it at the man's head. The blow knocked him back, and I jumped to my feet, advancing towards him. I swung at him again and kicked him several times, felt my anger take over completely. I blacked out, and when I regained my consciousness, the broomstick I held in my hands was bloody and broken. I looked down, and the man was dead. His nose was broken, and his ribs were cracked. Blood was pouring out of his mouth and onto the floor, adding to the pool of blood that was beginning to form. I wanted to scream. I wanted to call the police and tell them about what just happened, but I knew I couldn't. I couldn't tell anyone. They wouldn't believe me. They would call me crazy. The guy called me player 1. Was he a player in the game too? And was the sacrifice death? What if the other players came after me? Would I have to kill them too? The thoughts were too much for me, and I fell to my knees and grabbed the sides of my head. What was I going to do? My grandma was dead, and she was the only family I had left. The game master said I could obtain what I wanted most by winning the game, but winning meant I had to kill more people. I couldn't do that. I'm not a murderer. If killing one person did this to me, there was no way I could kill another person. Then again, if I didn't obey the game master's rules, he would kill me. I wasn't ready to die. Not yet. Then I realized something. If I killed everyone and won the game, I could just tell the game master to bring everyone back. With that in mind, I rose to my feet and began to walk back outside. Once I reached my car, I climbed in, turned the car on, and drove back to my apartment. I walked inside and went to my room, and saw the small black book sitting on my bed. The cover was open and turned to the second page of the book. I walked over to the book and picked it up, seeing a short sentence written across the middle of the page, which read, "Congratulations on a job well done." What? I wondered aloud, rereading the sentence a few more times. You are learning quickly, player one, but don't let your aspirations consume you. The game master's voice came from somewhere behind me, but I knew better than to try and look. What do you mean? I asked, but heard no reply. A few minutes passed, and I resolved to just try to get some sleep. I laid down on my bed and shut my eyes, quickly falling into a deep sleep. I only remember having one dream last night. I saw a middle-aged woman standing outside of a flower shop. She looked very forlorn, and mixed with this sad look was an expression of paranoia. She looked warily at everyone who passed her by, flinching away from anyone or anything that grew too close to her. Suddenly, the deep voice of the game master came to me. You have killed player 3 and seen player 2. 4 is all you need. Will you make it? He asked. I have seen player 2? That woman! I heard no reply from the game master, and I don't remember anything else happening in the dream. When I awoke, I tried to remember the face of the woman I had seen in my dream. The sooner I found her and took her out of the game, the sooner I could bring everyone back. I grabbed my keys, then put them back down. Finding someone wasn't going to be easy, and I needed to be thorough. I put on a jacket and walked outside and down the street. In the dream, she was standing outside of a flower shop. Nevertheless, I decided to check outside the flower shop where she was in my dream, so I walked down to the only flower shop in town. But she wasn't there. I checked inside, only to find nothing. Maybe I was right about one of her friends dying. I began the trek down to the cemetery located south of town. It was pretty far off, but I didn't have time to get my car, so I started to jog. As I grew closer, the sky grew darker, and rain started to fall, picking up as I reached the gate of the cemetery. I looked in and saw a lone person with a raincoat on and an umbrella over their head. I walked through the gate and up to the person. They must have heard me coming because they turned around to face me as I approached them. As the person turned, I saw the face of the woman from my dream. She looked even more tired and depressed than she was in the dream. She held a knife in her right hand. Player 1, I don't want to hurt anyone. I can't, but you can, can't you? She asked, her voice shaky. I'm not a murderer, I stammered. She took a step towards me, and I stepped away from her. I'm not going to hurt you. I just want this terrible game to end. Can you do that for me? I've already lost my husband to the game and I wanted to bring him back, but I couldn't bring myself to kill anyone. The game allows us insights of other players through our dreams. My insight was of you, and the voice told me you were player 1. I hoped you would see me too and we could meet. Now I'm asking you to end this for me. Could you do that? She lost her husband to the game? Then the man I killed. I tried to shake off the thoughts. After all, I was going to bring everyone back in the end. She gave me the knife she was holding and told me to end her life. She looked completely calm and ready to die. I made it quick and walked out of the cemetery, my resolve to end things stronger than ever. I began the long walk back home, And by the time I made it back, I was exhausted and more ready than ever to get some sleep. I was almost to my apartment door when I heard a noise that sounded like sobbing. I followed the noise and soon found a young girl walking down the sidewalk with her head down and tears streaming down her face. She looked no older than 9 years old, and she was alone. I sped up my walking ND. When I caught up to her, I kneeled down in front of her and asked her what was wrong. Her response was quiet, and due to her crying, her words were slurred. "What did you say?" I asked. "My mommy and daddy are gone. I don't know where they are," she said, her voice a little clearer. "Do you want to come to my house? Then we can try to find your parents. Sound good?" "Okay, thank you, Mr." The girl grabbed my arm and followed me back to my apartment. Once we were inside, she sat down on the couch in my living room and told me she was thirsty. I went into the kitchen to get her something to drink, which was just water. She took the bottle of water and took a sip of it. We sat in silence for a while. "I had a really bad dream last night," she said. "About what?" "I was in this black room, and there were people that looked like shadows, but they were standing up. Then a ball of light was in the sky, and it looked like a man. One of the shadow people started talking, but I didn't hear what he said, and then the man in the light looked at him and laughed, and I don't remember anything else." Shivers ran down my spine. Was this girl a player in the game? If so, then... "Hey, mister, where you going?" the girl said. I tried to deny it. If the girl was a player in the game, then that would mean I had to take her out of it. I had to win the game, but could I really just take a child's life like that? The other players at least had a reason for it. I killed the man in self-defense, and the woman asked me to kill her. But this girl had done nothing wrong. She had no reason to die. The internal struggle was too much, but I tried to ignore it and keep moving. I tried to remember my motive for all this, and then I remembered something. Don't let your aspirations consume you. That was what the game master told me. My aspirations, my motive for doing all that I had done, don't let them consume me. Could that mean that I came this far all for nothing? What if I couldn't bring them back? What if the game master lied? I tried to force the thoughts from my mind. I grabbed a knife from my kitchen drawer and walked back over to the living room where the girl sat, with my mind tearing itself in half as I made my way towards her. The sight made me realize how difficult it was for me when I was young to trust strangers due to my troubled childhood. I saw myself in the young child sitting before me. At this thought, I loosened my grip on the blade and let it fall to the floor, causing a loud clattering sound to ring throughout the small room as it made contact with the hardwood floor. I couldn't do it. The girl opened her mouth as if she were about to say something, but I stopped her. At first she looked hesitant, then stood to her feet and ran past me and out of my small apartment without a word. I fell to my knees, exhausted both mentally and physically from all that had happened. I felt completely worn out, and I had disobeyed the game master. What next? Death? Maybe that wouldn't be so bad. A cruel end to a worthless life. Maybe that was okay. Story number 3, October 29th. The announcement hit the internet like a bomb. Cochran Brothers Tech, famous for their viral mobile apps, had outdone themselves this time. Crips and Corpses, the latest offering from the tech giant, promised to bring Halloween to life like never before. It was an augmented reality game designed to transform the last 2 days of the month into a twisted scavenger hunt. The trailer alone was enough to send chills down spines, grinning skeletons, decaying zombies, and creepy crypts, all superimposed onto real-world locations through your phone. David stood in line at the coffee shop, scrolling through his phone as the buzz about the game raced across social media. His group chat was already lit. "Yo, you see the new Cochrane game? This is gonna be sick. I'm stoked to nail some zombies." David's heart galloped as he read. Cochrane Brothers had a reputation for pushing the boundaries of mobile gaming, and this sounded like the craze to end all crazes. What could be more exciting than storming the streets, competing to tag virtual corpses, and earning points for swag? The game promised to be the next Pokemon Go, but a quantum leap beyond. The app's concept was simple. For the duration of the game, random places would be tagged as crypts on the app's map. Players, called grave diggers, could visit these real-world locations and use their phones to reveal hidden bodies, grotesque, cartoonish corpses that only existed in the digital space. Each tagged corpse earned points. The first player to tag a corpse bagged the most points. Then the value of the corpse diminished with each successive tag. Points could be traded for in-game badges advertising the grave digger's prowess, discounts on other Cochrane games, or cold, hard cash. It was a hell of a game. David scrolled through the app's description on the website, watching the promotional video flash images of laughing players tagging glowing, animated bodies, and the sound effects were to die for. Cackling witches, moaning zombies, and screaming skulls. For starters, David viewed the demo with rapt attention. His eyes widened as he read the game's top prize, $100,000 for the winning player. The prize was set to be announced at 11:59 on Halloween night, 1 second before midnight. A chyron slid across the bottom of the screen. "The fun begins at midnight. Download now. Win 100K. The starter kit. A countdown written in Gothic font ticked down the time before game launch. 8 hours, 27 minutes, and 11 seconds. David glanced around the crowded cafe, bustling with anticipation. In just a few hours, Crips and Corpses, or C&C as the company nicknamed it, would transform the entire country into a freaky virtual cemetery. David gleefully downloaded the app. As he did, his eyes caught a glimpse of the fine print at the bottom of the page, labeled Legal Disclaimer. He leaned in closer, chuckling as he read aloud. No actual zombies were harmed in the creation of this game. All jack-o'-lanterns raised on free-range pumpkin farms. Any resemblance of in-game witches to Martha Stewart is entirely unintentional. All corpses are fictitious, and any resemblance to real persons, living, dead, or undead, is purely coincidental. Maybe. His laughter faded as he continued to read. The tone shifted, the words becoming darker. Cochrane Brothers Tech LLC is not responsible for any injuries or damages that may occur during gameplay. Participation is at your own risk. The creators reserve the right to terminate players who fail to abide by game rules. Decisions of game judges are final and unappealable. David tried to laugh, but it felt forced. The last part sounded like serious legalese, but it had to be a joke, right? As he stared at the screen, an unsettling unease fluttered in his stomach. Shaking his head, David dismissed the odd sensation as mere nerves and turned his focus back to the excitement popping around him. October 30th. David was smiling when he woke up. It was still October, but to David it felt like Christmas morning. Day 1 of C&C. He raced downstairs to the kitchen, springing 3 steps at a time. He booted up the percolator, and soon the scent of pumpkin spice wafted through the air, an aroma that conjured up memories of Halloween past. David started clacking on his phone, excitement bubbling inside him like a witch's cauldron. After scrolling through a few notifications, he landed on the top news story. Cochrane Brothers launch Halloween event. C&C goes live. A grin spread across his face as he read the article detailing how players were already tagging corpses and competing for prizes. Reports mentioned traffic jams and crowd surges as eager players flash-mobbed unsuspecting public locales. There had been a few injuries and fender benders, but nothing serious. One crotchety old man was interviewed, shaking his fist at the chaotic scene outside his porch. "I wish those kids would get off my damn lawn," he grumbled, his frustration a comical reminder of how the game was already upending neighborhoods across America. "We are not the game anymore," he declared. "We are work." David laughed at the oldster. "Get off my damn lawn? Did he really just say that?" David thought the geezer looked like Crypt Keeper from Tales from the Crypt, complete with a ghoulish, half-dead countenance and tattered clothes. David wished he knew where he lived. How much fun it would be to TP his house on Hallows' Eve. "Today's the day," David shouted and pumped his fist. He checked the game app on his phone. The countdown timer ticked down to the game's finish line, 38 hours, 45 minutes, and 23 seconds away. David poured a cup of coffee. Just as he took a sip, his phone buzzed with a game update. "The game is live. Hunt for crypts in your area. Tag corpses. Win 100K. There was no time to lose. It was time to hit the streets. David grabbed a granola bar and rushed out the door, his heart thumping. The sun sparkled brightly and the neighborhood zizzed with bustle. As David booted up the game, other players scampered past him, their faces buried in their phones. Laughter and shouts rang through the air. David already felt a sense of bonded camaraderie with these strangers, all united by the thrill of the best game ever. Arriving at the park, David spotted the first crypt icon blinking on his app. It was nestled beneath a sprawling oak, its branches swaying gently in the breeze, like jagged arms inviting a hug. He approached the tree, adrenaline coursing through him as he raised his phone to scan the area. A cartoonish corpse popped on David's screen, sprawled out comically on the grass, with googly eyes and a goofy grin. It donned jeans and a t-shirt, reading, "Grateful Dead." David snickered as he tagged the corpse, his phone vibrating with a spooky cackle as it rung up his newly won points. "Gotcha," he exclaimed. The hunt was on. Players skipped from one location to another, one crypt after another, tagging corpses and racking up points. The excitement was mounting with every ping of their phones. Just as he was about to tag another corpse, David spotted a familiar figure approaching. It was Raven, her signature goth style unmistakable even from a distance. Today she wore a black sweatshirt emblazoned with a faded graphic of a skull and the words, "We are the weirdos, mister." Raven's goth uniform was rounded out with combat boots and a plaid skirt that swayed as she walked. She was clutching her phone like a talisman. "Hey, Gourdhead," she called, her voice dripping with her signature sarcasm. "Nice threads, Raven," David replied, grinning. "Planning a tea party with the dead?" Abby shrugged. "You know it," she shot back, her dark eyes, black contact lenses, glittering like onyx. "I'll take a wild guess," David said, pointing at Raven's phone. "Corpse hunting." "Hell to the yeah. I just bagged 3 of the nasties. First tag, maximal points," Raven shouted, her arms sweeping the park. A glowing path led out of it. "Exercise," I said as I followed, downing my chocolate before I moved. David laughed. "Wanna hunt together?" "Sure. Let's see how many points we can rack up before sunset." She reflected, then added, "But if we win the 100 grand, it's a 60-40 split, since I'm the brains of this operation." David laughed. "Deal." As they stalked corpses together, their dark banter turned the adventure into a shared quest. They raced about, tagging virtual beasties, swapping insults and fantasizing about what they'd do with the 100,000 when they won. But as daylight dwindled, David noticed an arresting shift. The corpses they were tagging began to resemble real people more and more. The cartoonish animations were fading away, replaced by avatars that appeared very human. David did a double take when the game displayed a corpse swinging by the neck from a tree, his tongue lolling from his mouth, his lifeless blue eyes bulging. The corpse, David thought, could pass for a twin of the crotchety crypt keeper quoted on the news that morning. David dutifully tagged it and bagged his points, but frowned as he heard the now familiar cackle announcing his increased score. Raven noticed her friend's shifted mood. "David, what's up?" she asked. "Nothing, it's just, well, it's getting a little weird, don't you think?" David glanced around at the players milling about. Their enthusiasm seemed to be morphing too, alloyed now with confusion, as if they couldn't quite believe the realism they were seeing on their screens. Raven let out a laugh. "Duh, that's the point, dummy. Halloween, remember? Bring on the weirdness." Then a boy sprinted past them, his face pale with terror. "They're gonna kill me! They're gonna kill me!" he screamed, his visceral voice ringing through the park. David stared at the boy sprinting away. "That kid looks serious, Raven." "As if," Raven replied, but David could see a hint of tension in her eyes. Her excitement now carried the undertone of apprehension. "Maybe we should head home," David suggested. "Oh, shut up," Raven blurted. "That kid was just trying to spook us." "Well, he succeeded," David admitted. He tried to get back into the spirit, spending the rest of the afternoon with the still enthused Raven. But he couldn't completely shake the feeling that something was off. He glimpsed at the app's countdown clock, ticking down to midnight on Halloween. 31 hours, 12 minutes, 52 seconds. October 31st, 9:40 a.m. David jolted awake to the sound of his phone buzzing incessantly on the nightstand. Still groggy, he grabbed it, squinting at the flashing screen. His heart raced as he saw multiple notifications from the CNC app. David clicked on the top news story, and a sense of unease washed over him as he read the headline. CNC players report realistic corpses. Backlash ensues. The article detailed what David already knew. The game's corpses had started looking increasingly lifelike, causing players to believe they were seeing people they recognized. David clicked the video clip accompanying the article. The CEO of Cochran Brothers, a jovial-looking fellow, was attempting to spin the situation. "It's all in good fun, folks. Just a bit of Halloween spirit, right? It's part of the game." But even as he smiled, there was an unsettling twitch in his eyes. A montage of player videos flashed across the screen, showcasing scenes as players reacted to the lifelike corpse avatars. One video showed a player screaming and tossing away his phone. Another player looked catatonic, holding up his phone in a shaky hand. The avatar corpse looked like a mirror image of the player. David's stomach knotted. This was too sick to be played off as a joke. The doorbell rang. It was Raven. "You ready to go out? 100 grand beckons." "Raven," David replied. "I think you should see this." He scooped up the remote in the living room and flicked on a TV news channel. A reporter was interviewing a rotund woman in Memphis. The woman was apoplectic, her hazel eyes flashing with horrified anger. "The app sent me a corpse that looked just like my mother. I'm going to sue those bastards." The news anchor reappeared, going on to detail that the Memphis woman's experience was being echoed across America. In response to the outrage, representatives of the Federal Trade Commission and Federal Communication Commission have announced that they plan to investigate. David turned to his friend. "Something's wrong," he said. "That woman," Raven blew a raspberry. "Oh, please. Don't you know a shill when you see one?" Cochran Brothers obviously paid her to say that. What better way to stoke up interest in the game? It's genius, if you ask me. David shook his head. "But they said it was happening across the country." "Well," replied half-heartedly, "the Cochran Brothers are billionaires. They can buy lots of actors to plant fake stories." But Raven's voice betrayed a hint of doubt. "I don't know, Raven." Raven's phone buzzed. She brought it to her face. Exhilaration thrilled through her features. "No friggin' way," she gasped. She screamed. "The next crypt?" It's my old hellhole of a high school. No way I'm missing out on that corpse. She glared at David. You gonna go with me? Or are you gonna wimp out 'cause you're too scared? She sneered as she raised air quotes around the last word. David pondered. The thought of Raven fending for herself in the increasingly macabre maelstrom outside made him nervous. I'll go, he said, trying to sound lighthearted, if only to keep you from getting into too much trouble. Raven cheered and offered a high five. October 31st, 10:35 a.m. Raven drove them to the school in her black vintage Volkswagen Bug. David's eyes teared as Raven chain-smoked one cigarette after another as she drove. The car inched along at a snail's pace, since packs of CNC players were darting in and out of traffic, eyes riveted to their phones, chasing the next assigned corpse. Above their heads, the stars glowed as the police captions squatted. They parked near the school, and Raven studied her phone. Her eyes grew wide. Oh, snap. What's wrong? Nothing, Raven cheered. The corpse we gotta tag is in the principal's office. It's Principal Himbry. Awesome. I don't know if this is a good idea, David replied. The school? The principal's office. We could get arrested for trespassing. He pointed to the school door. Oh, grow a pair, Raven scoffed, her eyes narrowing into angry slits. No way I'm missing out on this. Himbry must have given me 1,000,000 detentions when I was here. He even patrolled the length of my skirt for frick's sake. He made up some nonsense that my clothes didn't follow the quote-unquote dress code. But that was bullshit. The perv just wanted an excuse to tag his dead ass. I shall take this as a covered story next time I hit the streets in the next... With a sigh, David surrendered. He knew he should put his foot down, but he also knew Raven. Nothing could stop her when she was on a mission. Fine, he said, trying to be firm. But if anything seems off, we're leaving. As they entered the school, the familiar halls felt eerily quiet. The buzz of students and laughter usually filled the space, but today, an ominous silence hung in the air. Weird, David said. Weird is everyone. Raven shrugged. Maybe they're in class, or attending a Halloween assembly, or maybe everyone just ditched school to play CNC. They made their way to the principal's office, the walls lined with motivational posters that felt incongruous in the tomb-silent school. Raven glanced at her phone. 10,000 points to tag Himbry. Hurry. They went to the school office, also abandoned, and crept to the principal's office door. David's hand hovered over the doorknob. Raven, are you sure about this? Do you really gotta ask? She laughed, pushing the door. It opened with a protesting squeal. The room was dimly lit, papers strewn across the desk, as if a storm had blown through. David felt a foreboding chill. Maybe we should turn back, he suggested weakly. But Raven was already scanning the room with her phone, excitement bubbling over. No way. I want my 10,000 points. Where's the Farkin corpse? You know who I am. Then David saw it. There, slumped over the desk, was Principal Himbry. His body lay lifeless, a pen still clutched in his cold fingers. His face was fixed in a rictus of terror. Raven! David's unbelieving voice trembled as he stepped closer. It's Himbry. It's really him. Raven froze, her excitement draining as she took in the scene. This can't be happening. David staggered back, his mind racing. It can't, but it is. Fine. They stood in paralyzed silence, reality crashing down around them. Raven eyed Himbry's desk. She squinted, puzzled. David? What? Raven spoke slowly. Himbry doesn't have a phone. How could the game... Her question was cut off by the boom of the school's front door banging open. Police! Barked a voice. Is anybody here? Let's go, David exclaimed. How? Susie still holding her breath. October 31st. David and Raven bolted from the school, adrenaline coursing through their veins. Their breaths came in frantic bursts, each footfall stoking their panic. The chill of the autumn air bit at their skin as they sprinted down the sidewalk. In a split-second decision, they abandoned Raven's car. The streets were gridlocked, a cacophony of honking, shouting, and smashing metal. It was pandemonium, the world around them spiraling into a nightmare. They arrived, breathless, at David's house. They burst through the front door and bolted it shut behind them. David flicked on the TV. Reports are flooding in from across the country of CNC players encountering real corpses. Police are struggling to respond to reports of missing persons. The news anchor's voice rang out in barely suppressed panic. Then, after a moment's thought, David's stomach dropped as horrifying images flashed on the screen. Unbelieving players surveying grotesque scenes, their shoes dipped in blood. Federal authorities report that they have been unable to locate the Cochran Brothers' CEO, Wilfred McReary. The Federal Emergency Management Agency is urging players to stay indoors and report any other suspicious activity related to the game to local police. "What the hell does that mean?" Raven muttered, shaking her head, her face ghost white. "Report others' suspicious activity, as if people dropping dead at random doesn't count as suspicious enough?" I said dismissively. "I was just asking questions. It's not bad training to do so according to research." Before David could respond, his phone buzzed violently. He hauled it out, his eyes widening as a notification from the game appeared, the words glowing ominously on the screen. "Don't be scared. Just play. You're both in this together. Win 100K. "Moulay." "What the hell?" he breathed, a chill thrilling up his spine. Raven glanced over his shoulder, her eyes darting between the TV and his phone. "You're both in this together? How the hell can the game see us?" As if on cue, another notification pinged. "There's a corpse next door. 5,000 points. Win 100K. Ezra Reed. David's skin prickled, the weight of the words hanging heavy in the air. "I don't know if..." Raven's phone buzzed. "Tag the corpses, or you might be next. Win 100K, he muttered. "What? Why are they sending these? This is beyond farked up," Raven cried, her fingers trembling over the screen. "I don't think they are in control anymore," David mumbled numbly. "Look," Raven pointed at the TV. "The FBI is trying to shut down the CNC server." The anchor confirmed Raven's words. Despite attempts to shut down the main server, it seems the game has embedded itself in the fabric of the internet, hijacking servers and creating mirror sites of itself. Authorities are urging people to stay indoors and ignore urgings of the... Then the newscast was interrupted by a blank screen and the trill of a simple tone, familiar and chilling. An emergency broadcast system alert. October 31st, 2000 p.m. David and Raven stood stock still, mouths agape, as the TV blared the emergency broadcast, the flickering screen casting an ominous glow in the dimly lit room. The president has declared a national emergency, intoned in artificial voice in a metallic monotone. Due to events of an unconventional nature, you are strongly advised to return to your homes and shelter in place. You are advised to remain with trusted friends or family members through the duration of this emergency. Under no circumstances should anyone remain alone. We will provide further details as they become available. That is all." Raven blinked, her expression stricken. She opened her mouth to speak, but couldn't find words. David took her hand in his, trying to offer some semblance of comfort. "At least we're not alone. We're safe," he reassured, though the tremor in his voice betrayed his uncertainty. "Are you kidding me?" Raven snapped, jolting her hand back, her voice rising. "Who knows who's safe or not?" The thud of his heart whooshed in his ears. "You heard the message," Maybe the game can only get you if you're alone. Like Principal Himbry, he reasoned, more desperate to convince himself than convince Raven. Raven snorted. Game? Does this look like a game to you? It's gone totally rogue. Even the company's CEO has jumped ship. David's gaze locked on the TV, the newscast having returned. Chaos reigned in real time. Panicked people were turning on each other now, clawing each other bloody as they stampeded to obey the game's commands and tagged corpses, desperately believing that submitting to the game's whims was the key to staying alive. We can't even be sure if this quote-unquote game will really end at midnight, Raven added, if we even live that long. She rubbed her temples, trying to stave off a headache. Televised images of bodies in the street made David wonder. Were they killed by the game, or by the panic the game had prompted? It was impossible to tell. Raven, I have no idea what's going on, David admitted. I only know one thing. Yeah? And what's that? She shot back. He gently put his arm around her and leaned closer. Nothing's going to happen to you if I have anything to say about it. His voice dropped to a whisper, but it was a vow David meant with all his heart. One thing led to another. Raven's features softened slightly at his words, the tension in her shoulders easing just a fraction. She took his hand, the warmth of their connection grounding them amidst the chaos. Well, me too, she replied, her voice quieter but no less sincere. David's phone buzzed again. He looked at the notification. 500? 0. 0 points. For every player you eliminate. Win 100. October 31st, 9 p.m. As the sun sank beneath the horizon, replaced by the cold glow of the moon, David and Raven were still glued to their screens. They refreshed news feeds and game notifications with the desperation of drowning souls grasping for a lifeline. Every threatening ping jarred their reflexes to act, though by now they were numb. The realization was creeping upon them. Death was just a matter of time, either caused by the rogue game or the mobs outside. Helia's sounds of pandemonium invaded the house. People screaming, people begging for mercy, gunshots. David knew he would carry for the rest of his life, short as that might be. The sound of a desperate young woman's pleading voice. "Steve, you can't just leave me like this. Steve." To use the proper term, it was a mercy more than words. Then, with a sudden flicker, the lights dimmed. A sharp crack followed, plunging them into darkness. "Shite, not now," Raven cried. David tried to access the power company's website. "I can't get anything," he muttered, staring at the unresponsive screen. "Internet's dead." Raven swiped at her phone in disbelief, but when it failed her to, she let out a low growl. Without warning, she hurled her phone against the wall. It shattered with a satisfying crack, pieces scattering like broken hope. For the first time in hours, Raven's lips curled into a genuine smile. "Now give me yours," she demanded. Her fingers curled around his, and she stroked. He raised an eyebrow, but her intent expression made him laugh. "Sure, why not?" He surrendered his phone. Raven smashed the phone against the wall with glee. A beat of silence. "Alone at last," David finally said, and gave Raven's hand a gentle squeeze. Raven glanced at him, sighing. "And Michael," Raven groaned. "Bruh," she said. "Don't even think about getting sappy on me. If you're about to confess some kind of deathbed quote-unquote undying love, I swear, just choke me now." "Sweet animal," Raven murmured, touching her pretty head to his fingertip. "I've been trying for the past 5 years to imagine what it's like to feel like when you finally contemplate the loss of someone you love, and don't even try to ask me." David's laughed honestly for the first time in days. No, he said, holding up his hands in mock surrender. What I meant to say is, Raven, you're the truest friend I've ever had. The goth's smirk softened. Back at ya, she said, then couldn't resist adding, even if you are a bit emo for my taste. They shared the moon-painted darkness, the weight of uncertainty replaced with the lightness of accepted fate. So this is how the world ends, David said after a moment, his voice reflective. Not with a bang, not with a whimper, but with a friggin' ab. What a bummer. In the distance, she heard shouts behind, the thump of weapons, and someone crying. Raven shrugged. Meh, at least we don't have to worry about Christmas shopping this year. David grinned. Small favors. After a pause, Raven turned to him, her eyes glinting mischievously in the faint moonlight. Hey, do you have a Ouija board? Alan frowned. David blinked, taken aback by the sudden question. Yeah? Why? Well, Raven pondered. If an app can kill people for real on Halloween, then maybe a Ouija board can contact the dead for real too. David stared at her for a second, then shrugged. I guess I can't argue with that logic. Worth a try. Who do you want to contact? Raven's expression softened. My dad. David felt a pang of sympathy. What do you want to ask him? Her lips curled into a wry smile. The one thing I've always wanted to know. What's that? Whether heaven has a smoking section, of course. David laughed and got up to retrieve the Ouija board. He plugged the Ouija board into his overhead,